You only got featured because I called the manager. My father texted me that while I stood alone in front of my own collection at my first gallery opening, the one neither he nor my mother bothered to attend, I had built every piece in that collection inside a freezing garage over 3 years. Cracked hands, a broken space heater. Some nights I wore my coat to the canvas. My father had never once opened that garage door. What he didn't know, what nobody in that gallery knew, was that I had spent 6 weeks quietly assembling 14 emails. Every message he had sent trying to sell my work to private buyers, with my name stripped from every contract. I didn't cry. I didn't call him back. I walked to the back wall of the gallery, where a framed display was already mounted, and I asked the gallery owner to come look. She called the police before she finished reading the third email. 40 people had read all 14 by the time the officers walked through that door. 3 of them were buyers my father had contacted directly. Not one has returned his calls since. Before I go on, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story speaks to you. Drop your location and local time in the comments. Now let me take you back to the night I found the first email, the one he sent the very week I finished my largest piece, with my own signature cropped out of the image. The temperature in the garage was 34 degrees. I know because the digital thermometer on the workbench blinked it at me every time the wind rattled the single-pane glass. I was 28 years old, and I was wearing a Carhartt jacket over 2 sweaters, my fingers wrapped in blue painter's tape to keep the skin from splitting further around my knuckles. This was my studio. It was a detached, uninsulated concrete box behind my parents' house. To my father, it was a liability he had managed to turn into an asset. To my mother, it was the place I went to waste my life. Maya, the envelope, my father said. He didn't come inside. He never did. He stood in the doorway, the light from the kitchen spilling across the driveway behind him, casting a long, sharp shadow that cut my easel in half. He didn't look at the 6-foot canvas I'd been working on for 10 hours. He didn't notice the smell of linseed oil or the way my breath came out in white puffs. He just held out his hand. I reached into my pocket and handed him the $800 in cash. That was the garage rent. It was more than some of my friends paid for actual apartments downtown, but my father called it a family discount on a commercial space. He counted the 20s slowly, his thumb snapping against the paper. "Stinks in here," he muttered, tucking the cash into his leather wallet. "You're going to ruin the resale value of this building with those fumes. And turn off that heater, you're running up my electric bill." "I'm paying for the electric, Dad," I said. My voice was flat. I was too tired to sharpen it. "It's in the rent agreement we signed." "Don't get technical with me," he said, pointing a finger at the space heater. It was a cheap, rattling unit with a broken plastic grill that only worked if you kicked it twice. "If it catches fire, it's my insurance, not yours. You're lucky I let you keep this junk in here at all." He turned and walked back toward the warm, yellow light of the house. He didn't close the garage door behind him. I had to get up, my joints stiff and aching, to pull the heavy wooden door shut and slide the bolt. That was the law of the house. Dad owned the dirt, so Dad owned the air I breathed on it. I went to the kitchen 10 minutes later to wash the charcoal off my hands. My mother was standing at the window, watching the steam rise from her tea. She didn't turn around when I walked in. "Your father says you're still using that heater," she said. "It's freezing, Mom." "It's a hobby, Maya," she said, finally looking at me. Her eyes traveled over my paint-stained jeans and the smudges on my forehead. "If you spent half the time you spend in that shed looking for a real management position at the firm, you could afford a real house. Instead, you're playing with crayons in the dark. It's embarrassing when the neighbors ask what you're doing back there." I didn't answer. I just scrubbed my hands until the skin was red and raw. The pattern was simple. I was the tenant who provided the cash flow. I worked 45 hours a week as a junior graphic designer, and every cent that didn't go to groceries went into my father's wallet or onto a canvas. They viewed my talent as a character flaw, a lingering childhood phase that was only tolerable because it paid the property taxes. A few days later, my phone buzzed. It was an Instagram notification. A woman named Alina, who owned the most respected gallery in the arts district, had commented on a photo of a texture study I'd posted. Interested in seeing more of this series. DM me. 2 hours later, Alina was standing in my garage. She was wearing a long wool coat and leather boots that looked like they cost more than my car. She didn't flinch at the smell. She didn't complain about the cold. She walked straight to the large canvas on the easel, a piece I'd titled The Cost of Shelter. My father saw her car and came scurrying out of the house, his business face on. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, stepping into the garage. He didn't look at me. He walked right up to Alina. "Richard Townsend, I manage the property. If you're looking for acquisitions, I'm the one you want to talk to. My daughter is just she's the labor." Alina didn't even turn her head. She kept her eyes locked on my painting. "I'm talking to the artist, Richard, thank you." She handed me a thick, cream-colored business card with embossed gold lettering. "I'd like to see your full portfolio, Maya, not here, in a place where I can actually see the colors. Come to the gallery on Friday." I held that card like it was a holy relic. After they left, I sat back down in front of the heater. I traced the raised letters of her name with my thumb. For the first time in 3 years, the air in the garage didn't feel quite so heavy. I spent the next 12 hours finishing my largest, most ambitious piece, a landscape of the city that looked like it was vibrating with light. I used a palette knife to thick, aggressive strokes. It was the best thing I had ever made. I left it on the easel to dry, the wet oil shimmering under the weak garage light, and went to my day job. I walked out of the garage feeling like I finally had a secret they couldn't touch. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in the garage until 4 in the morning, cleaning my brushes and prepping the city landscape for its trip to Alina's gallery. By 5, I was back in the main house, making coffee in the dark before my shift at the design firm. I felt like I was walking on air. The business card was tucked into my phone case, a golden ticket out of the freezing garage. I spent my entire shift at work staring at the clock, my mind already back in the studio. I had a vision for a companion piece, a study of the garage door itself, the way the light hit the peeling white paint. I caught the bus home at 6, my heart racing as I walked up the driveway. When I reached the garage, the first thing I noticed was the door. It was wide open. A cold pit formed in my stomach. I never left it open. I was meticulous about the bolt. I ran inside. The easel was standing in the center of the room, exactly where I'd left it, but it was empty. The canvas, my best work, the one that had finally made a professional take notice, was gone. I spun around, looking at the corners of the room. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard it hurt. Maybe I'd moved it to dry. Maybe I was so tired I'd tucked it behind the storage rack. I tore through the garage. I moved stacks of old sketches, knocked over a jar of dirty turpentine, and threw aside a pile of drop cloths. Nothing. The space where the canvas should have been was just a void of cold air. I burst through the back door of the house. My father was sitting at the kitchen table, reading a car magazine and sipping a beer. My mother was at the stove, stirring something that smelled like heavy cream and onions. "Where is it?" I gasped, my chest heaving. "Where's the landscape?" My father didn't look up from his magazine. He just flipped a page. "I did you a favor, Maya. That roof is worse than I thought. I went out there this morning to check the beams and the leak had finally given way." Water was pouring right onto that big frame of yours. "What?" I moved toward him, my hands shaking. "The roof doesn't leak over the easel, I checked." Well, it does now, he said, finally looking at me. His eyes were flat, disinterested. The canvas was soaked. Mold was already starting to set in the fibers, ruined. I had to haul it out of there before the smell got into the rest of the structure. Haul it where, Dad? Where is it? The county dump, he said, turning back to his magazine. I took a load of scrap metal and old drywall out there this afternoon. Tossed that right on top. It's probably under 10 tons of trash by now. You threw it away, I screamed. The sound was raw, tearing out of my throat. That was 3 months of work. That was my portfolio. My mother turned around then, her face set in that look of practiced pity. Maya, don't yell at your father. He was trying to protect the property. You know how dangerous mold can be. Besides, it was just one painting. You can always make another one. It's not like you're losing a paycheck over it. I didn't stay to argue. I grabbed my car keys and flew out the door. I drove to the county dump in a blur of tears and adrenaline. It was starting to rain, a cold, biting October drizzle that turned the world gray. By the time I pulled up to the gates, the facility was already locked for the night. I stood at the chain-link fence, looking out at the mountains of refuse, the rain soaking through my thin work shirt. I stayed there for an hour, calling the emergency number on the gate, begging the night watchman to let me in just to look. He told me to go home. Everything from the afternoon had already been compacted and moved to the pit. My masterpiece was gone. 3 years of saving for that specific grade of Belgian linen, 60 hours of layering glazes, the piece that was supposed to be my entrance into Alina's world, it was literal garbage. I drove back home in total silence. I didn't cry anymore. I felt hollowed out, like someone had taken a palette knife and scraped everything out from under my skin. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw my father's truck. It was backed up to the garage. He was standing there with a flashlight looking at the roof. He looked satisfied. I didn't say a word to him. I walked past him, went into the garage, and grabbed my heavy-duty tool kit. My hands were steady. My mind was a cold, sharp line. I went to the hardware store 10 minutes before they closed. I bought the heaviest, most expensive industrial padlock they had on the shelf. That night, under the dim yellow glow of the driveway light, I bolted the new hasp to the garage door. I snapped the lock shut with a heavy, metallic clack that echoed off the neighbor's house. I looked at the house. My father was watching me from the darkened living room window. I didn't look away. I held the key up so he could see it glint in the light, then I shoved it deep into my pocket. I didn't know yet that the painting wasn't at the dump. I didn't know that my father had already sent the first photo of it to a man in Chicago, claiming it was a new discovery from a private estate. All I knew was that I was done being a guest in my own life. I didn't go into the house for a long time. I sat on a milk crate in the dark garage, listening to the rain drum against the roof my father claimed was a sieve. The new padlock was a cold, heavy weight in my pocket. I knew the moment he saw it, the fragile piece of the last 3 years would vanish, but I didn't care. He had thrown away my soul. I was done letting him hold the keys to the room where I kept it. The explosion happened at 6:00 a.m. I was woken up by the sound of metal grinding against metal. I threw on my coat and ran to the back door. My father was standing at the garage, a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters in his hands. He was sweating, his face a mottled purple as he struggled with the industrial-grade steel of the lock I'd bought. "What do you think you're doing?" I shouted, stepping onto the wet grass. He spun around, the bolt cutters still gripped in his hands like a weapon. "What am I doing? What are you doing putting a lock on my building, Maya? This is my property, every square inch of it. I pay rent for that space, Dad, $800 a month. That gives me the right to secure my equipment." "It gives you the right to occupy it at my pleasure," he roared. He dropped the cutters and marched toward me, pointing a thick finger at my face. "You don't lock me out. Not of my house, not of my garage, not of anything. You think you're some big-shot artist now because some woman in a fancy coat came by? You're a tenant, and you're an ungrateful one. My mother appeared at the screen door, leaning against the frame. Maya, just give him the key. You're making him have a heart attack over a shed. Is it really worth all this drama? He threw my work away, Mom. And he's the one who provides the roof over your head, she snapped back. You provoked him with that lock. You know how he gets about respect. I looked at both of them. My father standing over his bolt cutters and my mother watching me with that bored, weary expression she used whenever I stood up for myself. I'm not giving you the key, I said. My voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. My father's eyes narrowed. He didn't pick the cutters back up. He didn't try to break the lock again. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face, the look he got right before he closed a deal he knew the other person couldn't afford. Fine, he said. Keep your lock, keep your key. He turned and walked toward the side of the house where the main breaker panel was housed in a gray metal box. He flipped the latch, scanned the labels, and found the one marked garage exterior. With one sharp, decisive click, he threw the switch. Dad, wait. No power, no lights, no heater, he said, turning back to me. If you want to be the master of your own domain, you can do it in the dark. Don't let me catch an extension cord running from the house, or I'll evict you by noon. Have fun painting with your coat on, Maya. He slammed the breaker box shut and walked inside. My mother followed him, pulling the screen door shut with a soft thud that felt like a final sentence. I stood in the yard as the sun began to rise over the neighborhood. I looked at the garage. It was a tomb now. No light, no warmth. The space heater, the only thing that made the winters bearable, was a useless hunk of plastic. I had to paint. Alina was expecting me on Friday, and I had 2 more pieces to finish for the series. I realized then that they weren't just indifferent to my work, they were actively trying to extinguish it. If they couldn't own it, they would break the person making it. I didn't realize it yet, but the darkness was exactly what I needed to see what was really happening in that house. The temperature dropped to 18 degrees that night. I didn't go into the house to sleep. I stayed in the garage, huddled on a pile of drop cloths, wrapped in 3 layers of wool and my heavy winter coat. My hands were so stiff they felt like wooden blocks. When I tried to curl my fingers, the skin over my knuckles pulled tight and burned. I was at the floor. Not just because it was cold, but because the silence of the garage felt like the silence of a grave. Without the hum of the space heater or the glow of the overhead lights, I was sitting in a concrete box that cost me $800 a month just to suffer in. I looked at my empty easel. I looked at my brushes soaking in a jar of frozen mineral spirits. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. I must have drifted off because I woke up to a soft, rhythmic scratching at the bottom of the garage door. I clicked on my small LED flashlight. A pair of yellow eyes reflected back at me from the gap under the wood. It was the neighborhood stray, a raggedy calico with half an ear missing that usually lived under the neighbor's porch. She squeezed through the gap, shivering so hard her fur looked like it was vibrating. "Hey, girl," I whispered. My voice was raspy from the cold. The cat didn't hesitate. She walked straight over to me, climbed onto my lap, and tucked herself into the crook of my elbow inside my coat. She was a tiny ball of heat, a living radiator in the middle of a freezer. I put my hand over her, feeling the steady, fast thrum of her heart. For the first time in 48 hours, I didn't feel like I was disappearing. I wasn't alone. Someone, even if it was just a 5-pound cat, decided that being near me was better than being anywhere else. I stayed like that for an hour, breathing in the smell of cold fur and old paint. My mind started to clear. I realized I couldn't stay in the dark forever. I needed to see what my father was doing while I was supposed to be learning a lesson. At 3:00 a.m., I knew he'd be deep asleep. He always took a heavy dose of nighttime cold medicine when the weather turned. I left the cat on the drop cloths, crept out of the garage, and used my old spare key to slip into the main house. The hallway was silent, smelling of floor wax and my mother's floral perfume. I made my way to my father's home office, my heart thumping against my ribs. I just wanted to flip the breaker from the inside to get an hour of light to pack my things. But as I reached for the panel in the mudroom, I saw a glow coming from the printer in his office. A single sheet of paper was sitting in the tray, the ink still fresh. I picked it up. It was a shipping invoice for a private courier service. The destination was an address in Chicago. The item description line read, "Original landscape, oil on linen, 48x60. The price listed at the bottom was $4,000. Stapled to the back of the invoice was a printed thumbnail photo of the piece. It was my city landscape, the one he said was ruined by mold and tossed in the dump. Only in this photo, the bottom right corner where I always placed my signature had been digitally blurred and cropped out. I stared at the paper until the words blurred. He didn't throw it away, he stole it. He stole it, stripped my name off it, and sold it for 5 months' worth of my rent. I looked at the invoice again. The seller wasn't listed as Richard Townsend. It was listed as RT Fine Art Brokerage. I didn't flip the breaker. I didn't make a sound. I took the invoice, folded it into a small square, and tucked it into my bra, right against my skin. I walked back out to the freezing garage, sat down next to the cat, and waited for the sun to come up. I wasn't cold anymore. I was burning. I didn't go to the dump. I didn't even go back inside the house to shower. I stayed in the garage with that calico cat until the sun was high enough to melt the frost off the windows. Then I drove straight to my shift at the design firm. I sat at my desk for 8 hours, staring at a monitor, the folded shipping invoice burning a hole in my pocket. By the time I got back to the house on Sunday, the lie had already taken root. It had grown branches. I walked through the front door and was hit by the smell of a pot roast, heavy on the rosemary, my mother's company meal. The entryway was lined with shoes. My Uncle Dave's loafers, my Aunt Sarah's heels. My parents were hosting a family dinner I hadn't even been invited to. I tried to slip upstairs, but my father's voice boomed from the dining room. "There she is, the artist in residence." I stopped at the archway. The table was full, 6 people, all with wine glasses in their hands. My father was at the head of the table, leaning back in his upholstered chair, his chest puffed out like a prize pigeon. My mother was next to him, beaming. "Maya, honey, come in," my mother said, though her eyes were flicking to my paint-stained hoodie with disapproval. "Your father was just telling everyone about his new venture. We're so proud." "New venture?" I asked. I stayed in the doorway, my hands deep in my pockets, fingers curled around the invoice. "RT Fine Art," Uncle Dave said, raising his glass toward my father. "Richard, I always knew you had an eye for value, but to find a private buyer for a $4,000 piece in your first month, that's talent. You're finally putting this family on the map." "It's all about the curation," my father said, waving a hand dismissively. "I've been studying the market for years." I saw a gap in the Chicago scene for high-end, emerging landscapes, and I moved on it. It's hard work, identifying the right assets and managing the logistics, but someone has to do it. "And Maya is helping with the shipping, right?" my Aunt Sarah asked, smiling at me. "It must be so nice to be useful to your father's business while you work on your little projects." The room went quiet for a second. Everyone was looking at me, not as an artist, but as the help. The daughter who moved the boxes for the genius in the room. "I didn't know you were an art broker, Dad," I said. My voice was dangerously steady. "Well, you've been so busy in that garage, I didn't want to distract you with the grown-up side of things," he said. He didn't look at me. He looked at his wine. "The business side is complicated, Maya. Contracts, wire transfers, reputation, you just focus on whatever it is you're doing out there. As long as you keep the rent coming in, we're all happy." He's been so generous letting you use that space, my mother added, sliding a plate of roast beef toward a vacant spot at the far end of the table, right next to the swinging kitchen door. Take notes, Maya, this is how you make a real living. I looked at the seating arrangement. My father at the head, surrounded by his admirers, my mother at his right hand. And the empty chair for me, tucked away in the corner where the drafts came in from the hall. I didn't sit down. I'm tired, I said. I think I'll go to bed. Suit yourself, my father muttered. More roast for people who appreciate it. I didn't go to bed. I waited until the laughter in the dining room turned into the clinking of dessert spoons. I crept into my father's office and sat in his chair. It still smelled like his cologne. I plugged a flash drive into his desktop. He hadn't even bothered to password protect his email. He thought I was too artistic to understand how a computer worked. I opened the folder marked sales. There they were. 14 separate email chains. 14 different paintings he'd taken from the garage while I was at work. Some were small studies, some were large canvases. He'd sold them all. Each one had a photo attached where he'd used a basic editing tool to blur my signature or crop it out entirely. The total was over $22,000. He hadn't just stolen one painting. He'd been harvesting my life for over a year. I hit download. I watched the progress bar crawl across the screen, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes. I didn't feel sad anymore. I didn't even feel angry. I felt like a hunter who had finally found the tracks. The drive finished. I pulled it out, tucked it into my pocket next to the invoice, and walked out of the house. I didn't check my phone until I was back in the garage, sitting in the dark with the cat. I had a message from Alina. See you tomorrow, 10:00 a.m. Don't be late, I have someone I want you to meet. I looked at the house. The lights were turning off one by one. They thought they had won. They thought they had turned me into a ghost in my own home. But I hadn't checked my sent folder yet. I didn't go back to the house to sleep. I waited in the garage until the sky turned a bruised purple, then I drove to Alina's gallery. I was 3 hours early. I sat in my car, watching the morning commuters rush toward their offices, my hand resting on the flash drive in my console. Alina arrived at 9:55 a.m. She didn't look like the polished gallery owner from my garage. She was wearing a charcoal jumpsuit and had her hair pulled back in a sharp knot. She unlocked the heavy glass doors and waved me inside. You look like you haven't slept in a week, Maya, she said, flipping the switches for the track lighting. One by one, the walls of the gallery came to life, white, expansive, and waiting. I haven't, I said. I pulled the flash drive from my pocket and set it on her mahogany desk. And I think I know why my landscape didn't make it to the dump. Alina listened in total silence as I told her about the shipping invoice, the RT Fine Art brokerage, and the 14 email chains I'd found on my father's computer. I showed her the printed thumbnail on the invoice, the one with my signature cropped out. She didn't gasp. She didn't offer me a platitude. She just leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the names on the digital files. I know these buyers, she whispered. 3 of them are my regular clients. Richard told them he was representing an anonymous estate that needed to liquidate assets quietly. He told them the artist was deceased. The air left my lungs. Deceased. He told them you were a tragic talent who died young, and he was the sole executor of the remains of your studio. Alina stood up and walked to the door, turning the deadbolt. She went to the back of the gallery and returned with a steaming mug of peppermint tea, pressing it into my cold hands. We aren't just going to show your work, Maya, she said. Her voice was low and hard, like a hammer striking an anvil. We're going to take back your name. She spent the next 4 hours cross-referencing my father's sales folder with her own contact list. Every time she found a match, her face got a little tighter. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. This was wire fraud, copyright theft, and a systematic erasure of my existence for profit. Your name is on every canvas he sold, Alina said, pointing to a high-resolution photo of a piece I'd finished a year ago. He can crop the photo, but he can't crop the physical paint. We're going to prove it. She helped me download and format the 14 key emails, the ones where my father explicitly claimed the work as his property to sell. We didn't just print them, we mounted them on high-quality, museum-grade gallery board. The show is in 6 weeks, Alina said. It was going to be a small debut. Now, it's going to be a reckoning. As I left the gallery, I felt a strange, vibrating energy in my limbs. I wasn't the labor anymore. I was the evidence. But I hadn't told my father I was moving my remaining pieces out yet. 6 weeks sounds like a long time until you're living in a race. I didn't sleep in the garage anymore. After moving my main canvases to Alina's gallery under the cover of a Tuesday night rainstorm, the space felt different. It was just a shell now, a concrete box with an empty easel and the lingering scent of turpentine. I kept the padlock on the door, and I kept the key in my shoe. My father didn't seem to notice the garage was emptying. He was too busy living his new life as Richard Townsend, art broker. He had started wearing a sports coat to breakfast. He bought a new leather briefcase and sat at the kitchen table every morning, loudly discussing logistics and client expectations into his phone while my mother toasted his bagels. "The Chicago buyer wants to know if there's more from that estate," he said one morning, looking at me over his glasses as I walked through the kitchen. "The one I liquidated last month. He's willing to go up to $5,000 for a centerpiece." "I thought that piece was ruined by mold, Dad," I said, pausing with my hand on the doorknob. He didn't even flinch. "I managed to salvage it. Specialized restoration. Cost me a fortune, but that's the business. You wouldn't understand the overhead, Maya. You just play with the brushes." I walked out before I said something that would ruin the next month of my life. The leverage wasn't just the emails, it was the physical proof. Alina had contacted a forensic document specialist she used for high-end insurance claims. They had analyzed the digital files I'd pulled from the flash drive. The metadata, the hidden digital footprint of every photo, showed the exact date and time the pictures were taken. They were all taken on Tuesdays and Thursdays between 2:00 p.m. and 4:00 p.m. The exact hours I was at the design firm. The exact hours my father claimed he was checking the property for maintenance. "It's premeditated," Alina told me during our final planning session. We were standing in the back of the gallery, looking at the 15th piece of the collection. It was a massive, heavy frame. Inside, we hadn't put a painting. We had mounted the 14 emails in a chronological grid, surrounding the original shipping invoice I'd taken from the printer. It looked like a work of art from a distance. Up close, it was a confession. "I've confirmed the RSVP list," Alina said, her voice tight. "The 3 local buyers your father conned are coming. They think they're here to see a tribute to the deceased artist whose work they bought. And my father, he thinks he's the guest of honor," she said. "He called me yesterday demanding a VIP section for his associates. I told him he'd have the most prominent spot in the room." I looked at the framed emails. The leverage was confirmed. It was heavy, it was documented, and it was sitting under a velvet drape in the most prestigious gallery in the city. I went home and handed my father the $800 for the final month's rent. He took it without looking at me, his mind already on the sports coat he was going to wear to the opening he thought he'd social engineered his way into. "I'm sending out the invitations tomorrow, Dad," I said. "I hope you and Mom can make it. It's a big night for the family." "We'll see," he muttered, snapping the 20s. "If I can fit it in between my real clients." I smiled. It was the first real smile I'd had in years. "I think you'll find the client list very familiar." It was 48 hours before the opening, and the house felt like it was holding its breath. I stayed out of the garage. I didn't want to see the empty space where my life used to be. I stayed in my childhood bedroom, the walls still a faded lavender, listening to the sound of my father humming in the hallway. He was in a spectacular mood. He had spent the morning polishing his shoes and practicing his business handshake in the hallway mirror. "Big night for the brokerage, Richard," my mother said, smoothing the lapels of his new navy sports coat. "You've worked so hard on this collection. It's only right you get the credit." "It's about vision, Martha," he said, checking his teeth in the mirror. "Most people just see paint. I see assets. I see opportunity." He looked over at me, standing in the doorway with my gym bag. "You coming to the gallery early to help set up the chairs, Maya? Alina said she's got a lot of high-profile guests. I don't want the place looking cluttered." "Alina and I have it under control, Dad," I said. "You just show up at 7. Wear the nice watch." "I intend to," he said, puffing out his chest. "I have a reputation to maintain now. Some of those buyers are coming specifically because I told them I'd have new inventory from the estate soon." I looked at him, the false confidence, the way he wore his theft like a badge of honor. He really believed he had won. He believed I was so small, so diminished by his years of family law, that I wouldn't even notice my own signature missing from the world. The next night, the gallery was quiet. The air smelled of fresh floor wax and expensive lilies. Alina and I stood in the back, watching the professional installers hang the final piece of the show. It was the heavy, museum-grade frame we'd spent weeks preparing. Inside, the 14 emails were arranged like a map of a crime scene. Alina stepped forward and draped a heavy, midnight blue velvet cloth over the frame. "Is it ready?" I asked. My voice sounded small in the high-ceilinged room. "It's more than ready," Alina said. She turned to me, her eyes reflecting the sharp gallery lights. "Tomorrow, they're going to see the labor for exactly who she is. Go home, Maya, get some sleep. Tomorrow is the last time you ever have to park on the street." I walked out of the gallery and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at my name printed in clean, modern vinyl on the front window. Maya TOWNSEND, the cost of shelter. I drove home and parked my car in the driveway, right behind my father's truck. I didn't hide it. I didn't apologize. I walked into the house, past the kitchen where my mother was laying out my father's cufflinks, and went to my room. I hadn't checked my phone all night. When I finally looked, I had a single new email from RT Fine Art Brokerage. It was a blind copy of a message my father had sent to his exclusive client list. "Join me tomorrow night for a private viewing. The estate is finally empty, and I am ready to close the books on this chapter. Highest offers will be accepted on the spot." He was selling my future before I'd even lived it. I deleted the email, closed my eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, I slept through the night. The gallery was a sea of black silk, expensive wool, and the low, rhythmic hum of 40 people trying to sound important. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, and the sharp, metallic tang of the white wine being circulated on silver trays. I stood by the entrance, my back straight, wearing a simple black dress I'd bought with 3 weeks' worth of grocery money. My hands didn't shake. I looked at the 3 men standing near the center of the room, Alina's VIPs. These were the local buyers who had bought my estate pieces from my father. They were admiring the cost of shelter, the 6-foot canvas that had almost frozen me to death in the garage. My phone buzzed in my clutch. I pulled it out. "You only got featured because I called the manager," the text from my father read. "Don't embarrass the family name by acting like you did this alone." I looked up. My father was just walking through the heavy glass doors. He looked like a caricature of success in his navy blazer, his chest puffed out so far his buttons looked strained. My mother was on his arm, draped in a pashmina, looking around the room as if she were checking for dust. "Richard, Martha." "You made it," Elena said, stepping forward with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She steered them toward the center of the room, right toward the three buyers. "Ah, Elena," my father boomed, his voice carrying over the music. "A decent turnout. I see some of my regular associates are already here. Gentlemen." He strode over to the three buyers, offering a hand. "I see you're enjoying the work. I told you the talent was exceptional before she passed, didn't I?" The tallest of the buyers, a man named Mr. Sterling, frowned. He looked from my father to the large, vibrant painting on the wall and then back to me. "Past, Richard, the artist is standing right there." The room went quiet. It was that specific kind of silence that happens when a glass shatters in a library. My father didn't miss a beat. He gave a forced, booming laugh and clapped Mr. Sterling on the shoulder. "Oh no, that's just Maya. She's the namesake. She handles the cataloging for the estate. A bit of a family tradition, you know. She's a hobbyist. The real artist, the one who painted that landscape in your office, is gone." I didn't wait for him to dig the hole any deeper. I walked to the back wall of the gallery. I stood in front of the 15-foot display covered in blue velvet. "Actually, Dad," I said. My voice was calm. It wasn't a scream. It was a statement of fact. "I'm very much alive. And I'd like everyone to see the cataloging I've been doing for the last 6 weeks." I grabbed the corner of the velvet drape and pulled. The heavy fabric hit the floor with a dull thud. Revealed behind it was the massive frame holding the 14 emails, the shipping invoices, and the blown-up photos of my paintings with my signature digitally cropped out. At the very top, in bold black letters, it read, "The Anatomy of a Brokerage." The room surged forward. Mr. Sterling was the first to reach it. He adjusted his glasses, leaning in to read the first email, the one where my father offered to sell my city landscape for $4,000, claiming I had died in a car accident 2 years ago. "This is my email address," Sterling whispered. He turned to my father, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of red. "Richard, you told me this girl was dead. You told me you were her executor. I have a wire transfer receipt for $5,000 in my pocket for a painting she's currently standing next to." "Now, wait a minute," my father stammered. He stepped back, his hands rising as if to ward off the words. That's a misunderstanding. Maya, tell them it's a joke. Martha, help me out here." My mother was staring at the wall, her face pale. She didn't move, she didn't speak. She just pulled her pashmina tighter around her shoulders, looking at the email where my father joked about how the girl was too stupid to realize her rent was paying for his new truck. "Is this your signature, Richard?" another buyer asked, pointing to a printed contract on the wall. "Because this looks like wire fraud to me. I was protecting her," my father suddenly shouted, his voice cracking. He turned to the room, sweat beaded on his forehead. "She's a child. She doesn't understand the market. I was holding that money in trust. I was building a future for her. You were charging her $800 a month to live in a freezing garage while you sold her soul behind her back," Elena said, stepping forward. She wasn't smiling anymore. She was holding the gallery phone. "And since you mentioned the market, Richard, I've already called the police. They're interested in the logistics of how you moved stolen property across state lines." The silence returned, heavier this time. My father looked around the room, searching for a friendly face, but everyone was looking at him like he was something they'd found on the bottom of their shoe. My Aunt Sarah, who had toasted his vision only weeks ago, stepped away from him so fast she nearly tripped. "You lied about her being dead, Richard. How could you?" "I'm leaving," my mother whispered. She turned and walked toward the door without looking at my father once. She defected in total silence, leaving him standing alone in the center of the white room. My father tried to grab my arm as I walked past him toward the front of the gallery. "Maya, stop this. We can talk about this at home. I'll give it all back. Just tell them it was a mistake." I stopped. I looked at his expensive watch, the one my rent had probably paid for. "The garage is locked, Dad," I said, "and I'm the only one with a key." I walked to the front window and watched as two patrol cars pulled up to the curb. My father sat down on one of the folding chairs he had told me to set up earlier. He looked small. He looked like the labor. It took the police 40 minutes to finish taking statements and another 20 to escort my father out of the building. He didn't go quietly. He kept shouting about family loyalty and business expenses until the cruiser door clicked shut, silencing him behind reinforced glass. The fallout was immediate and surgical. By the next morning, the RT Fine Art Brokerage website was a dead link. Mr. Sterling and the other two local buyers didn't just want their money back, they filed formal complaints for wire fraud and misrepresentation of assets. My father's reputation in the city, the one thing he valued more than my rent, wasn't just damaged. It was vaporized. My mother didn't come back to the house for 3 days. When she did, she didn't apologize. She just told me she was staying with Aunt Sarah until the legal unpleasantness was over. She blamed me for the noise, the police, and the embarrassment. But she didn't mention the emails. She couldn't look at the truth of what she'd enabled. I didn't stay to hear the rest of it. I used the money from my first legitimate gallery sale, a $5,000 check from a woman who actually knew my name, to put a deposit on a studio apartment downtown. It's small. The kitchen is a closet and the view is just a brick wall. But the heat works, and I'm the only one with a key to the door. 3 weeks later, I went back to the house to get the last of my things from the garage. The driveway was empty. My father's truck was gone, sold to pay for a high-end defense attorney who had already told him the evidence was problematic. The garage was silent. The space heater was still sitting in the corner, its broken plastic grill covered in a thin layer of dust. I picked it up and carried it to the curb. It was a piece of junk that had cost me 3 years of my life to keep running. I didn't need it anymore. My new studio is quiet, but it's not the silence of a grave. It's the silence of a beginning. I don't paint landscape studies of the city anymore. I paint the light coming through my own window. I paint the way my hands look when they aren't cracked from the cold. I paint without a coat. Yesterday, Alina stopped by. She didn't have a business card or a contract. She just had a cup of coffee and a question about a new series I'm starting. She sat on a stool and watched me work for an hour. "You're signing them in the middle now," she noticed, pointing to a canvas where my name was scrawled in bold, thick oil right near the center of the composition. "Yeah," I said, wiping a smudge of cobalt blue off my thumb. "I want to make sure it's the hardest thing to crop out. I'm Maya Townsend. I'm an artist. And for the first time in my life, I don't owe anyone rent for the right to exist." I sat on the floor of my new studio last night, eating pizza out of the box. The calico cat from the garage was curled up on the rug next to me, her purr vibrating against my leg. The room was 72 degrees. I didn't have to check a thermometer to know I was warm. I picked up a thick brush, dipped it into a pile of wet, vibrant crimson, and pressed it firmly against the bottom corner of a fresh white canvas. I signed my name, slowly, clearly, and so deep into the fibers that no amount of editing would ever be able to erase it. If your family stole your life's work and sold it for profit, would you have called the police in front of their clients, or would you have stayed silent to protect the family name? Next time, I'll tell you about a mother who secretly canceled her daughter's wedding out of spite and how 200 strangers showed up to replace her.